This is Software Engineering Radio, the podcast for professional developers on the web at se-radio.net. SE Radio is brought to you by the IEEE Computer Society and by IEEE Software Magazine. Online at computer.org/software.
Welcome to Software Engineering Radio, and this is Priyanka Raghavan. In this episode, we're going to be discussing the topic DevOps versus SRE, the differences, similarities, how they can work together for building successful platforms. Our guest today is Ganesh Datta, who is the CTO and co-founder of Cortex. Ganesh has an active interest in the areas of SRE and DevOps, primarily from spending many years working with both these SRE and DevOps teams, and now is a co-founder of a company that develops a platform for the latter. I also saw that Ganesh contributes a lot to this magazine called DevOps.com, where he's written on topics such as metrics, reviews of open source libraries, and also discussing testing strategies. So welcome to the show, Ganesh.
Thanks so much for having me.
At SE Radio, we've actually done quite a lot of shows on DevOps and SRE. We've done a show, like for example, episode 276 on site reliability engineering, episode 513 on DevOps practices to manage business applications. We also did an episode 457 on DevOps anti-patterns. And then there was also a show, episode 482 on infrastructures as code. So, a ton of stuff, but we never looked at, say, the differences between DevOps and SRE. And I thought this would be a perfect show to do. So that's why we're having you here. But before we jump into that, I'm going to actually dial it back and ask you if you could just explain in your own words what you think DevOps is for our listeners.
When I think about DevOps, there's obviously a lot of confusion between like DevOps and SRE, and there's people that kind of do a little bit of both. And so it's definitely a very open term. And I think the one thing that we always like to say is like, you don't necessarily just shoehorn yourself into one or the other. There's a lot of people that overlap. But when I think about DevOps, it's literally in the name, right? It's like developer operations. It's everything around how do we increase engineering efficiency, engineering productivity? How do we enable developers to operate and work their best? And that comes down to everything from tooling to pipelines to build systems to deployment systems to all that kind of stuff, I think is really owned by the DevOps team. And so anything that when you think about like development team operating their services, like that is exactly what DevOps falls under, I believe.
And so how about SRE then? What would you say about site reliability engineering?
Yeah, I think it's interesting because when you think about SRE, they sometimes do a lot of things that DevOps, you would think DevOps does, around like pipelines and things like that. But when I think about SRE, it's more from the lens of reliability. Like they're thinking about, are the processes that we have in place leading to better outcomes when it comes to reliability and uptime and those kinds of business metrics. And so SRE is mostly focused on defining and enforcing standards and reliability, building the tooling to make it easier for engineers to adopt those practices. And I think that's where some of the overlap comes in. We'll talk about that later, obviously. But anything that comes from a reliability or like post-production lens, I think falls under the SRE umbrella.
So there's also this, I think, a couple of videos and maybe articles where I've read where they typically define it as class SRE implements DevOps. That's one thing that I've seen. What's your take on that?
That's a really interesting way of putting it. I think it's true to some extent. When I think about SRE, it's like when I think about ops, you can break it down into like pre-production, to production, and post-production. Like those three are all totally fair parts of the system. And I think SRE generally lives in that kind of post-prod environment where they're defining those standards. Obviously, like there are the things you have to build into your systems beforehand, but mostly they're thinking about like, hey, once things are live, when things are out, do we have visibility? Are we doing the right things? And so I like to think most SRE teams live in that world. And so it's kind of like SRE implements post-prod ops, implements DevOps. So maybe like another tree down, where in reality, it should be SRE implements DevOps because you should be working together and being kind of working across the stack. So yeah, I really like that way of putting it.
So the other question I've been meaning to ask is that there's a lot of confusion in the roles, but you've kind of broken it down for us here. But there's also these other new roles that I keep seeing in many companies. For example, this infrastructure engineering or cloud engineer. Are these also like different names for the same thing?
I think it's another one of those cases where there's still a lot of overlap. So like when I think about cloud engineering, it's almost like pre-DevOps. Like if DevOps is kind of focused on, hey, how do we enable teams to build their code, run their code, get it into our cloud, deploy it, monitor it, things like that. Then cloud engineering is like even more like one step behind that. It's like, what is our cloud? Where are we building it? What does it look like? How do we track it? How do we, like, are we using infrastructure as code? Like setting the true foundations of everything and like kind of like building those bare bones stack, and then everything else kind of builds on top of that. So I think that's where kind of cloud engineering generally ends. And I think cloud engineering probably has like that more of that pre-prod overlap with DevOps, and then SRE has like the post-prod overlap with DevOps, and so they're kind of living in similar worlds. But yeah, cloud engineering in my mind is more around like truly building that foundation and then enabling DevOps to then do their job, which is then enabling developers to do their job.
And where do you think these things differ? So is it just on the environment or anything else?
Yeah, I think it comes down to the outcome. So like when you think about like building these teams internally, I think you had to take a step back and say, what exactly are we trying to solve? Like what is the desired outcome? If your desired outcome is, hey, our developers are not setting up monitoring correctly, they're not, maybe their pipeline doesn't have enough automation for setting up that kind of stuff. We have uptime problems. Okay, you're thinking about reliability, you need an SRE team, right? Even if there might be some overlap with like what the DevOps team is doing, if your desired outcome is reliability, that's probably going to be your first step. If your problem is, hey, we've got stuff all over GCP, we have things on App Engine, we've got things on Kubernetes, we've got RDS, we've got people running things in Kubernetes, like, okay, you got to take a step back and say, okay, we have a weak foundation. We need to build that foundation first. Okay, you're probably going to look at cloud engineering. And then you say like, okay, we know we've kind of invested in our cloud. We have some idea of how we're doing it. It's just really hard to get there. Like we have Kubernetes, that's our future. But for a developer to build their deployment, get into Kubernetes, monitor it, that's going to be really hard. Okay, you're probably thinking about DevOps. So I think taking a step back and thinking about what is the end goal, that will answer the question of what do you need today?
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. So I think sort of understanding your outcome defines your role is what we get from this.
Exactly.
Okay.
And I think that's where like a lot of teams struggle is like they don't have those clear charters. And I think the more clearly you can define the charter and say like this is what success looks like for a team, the better those teams can work. Because DevOps is a very broad space. Like SRE is very, very broad. And so even within that, I think you have to kind of give people that charter and say, this is exactly what we care about. Like, is it, we want more visibility. Like we don't necessarily have uptime issues, but we don't know if we have uptime issues. Okay, like your charter is going to be a bit different. It's like enabling monitoring and observability versus, hey, let's put together SLOs and create that culture of monitoring excellence. So like even within that, there's like different charters and you have to be very intentional about what that charter is.
So in your experience, what do you think about the team sizes then? Would that again depend on your charter? Would it go back to that and then you decide?
Yeah, I think it really depends on the charter. I think, you probably want to start with smaller teams to begin with. Like you don't want to just bring on a team of like 10 SREs and then say like, okay, you guys are just going to go do everything. Because then that causes thrash for the SRE team, but then also thrash for the development teams because they're saying, hey, everyone's asking something different of me. Like I have no idea what I'm doing. So be very intentional about like what your charter is. And then that kind of dictates your team. And obviously that charter might change over time, right? Like if you start today with like, hey, uptime is what we really care about. We have problems with that, reliability. Okay, you have a small team, your standard 3 to 6 people, maybe kind of focused on that. And then you have some other issues around observability and monitoring. Maybe that team kind of splits in half and focuses in on it. And then you can start kind of growing that team and have a team dedicated on observability and monitoring. And you kind of see this in organizations that have been doing SRE for a while. Like you look at startups that have maybe 100 to 300 people on an engineering team, you see like one dedicated SRE team that just kind of does everything. But you look at companies that have more established SRE foundations and you see head of reliability, head of observability. And like even within that, you have people that are kind of running those individual charters. So I think obviously teams are not going to get there immediately. So don't try to do everything all at once and build out too many teams. Start small and kind of figure out where your weaknesses are and hire around that.
I think that perfectly explains what we see. So I guess if you're more mature as an organization, you could probably spend more time in reliability and things like that. Whereas if you're really just starting up, then maybe your foundation is not good enough to actually even know what you need to be looking at. Yeah. I think that probably makes a good segue into our next section where I wanted to mainly talk about, say, tooling, the metrics, and maybe the role challenges. So let's jump in. Like the DevOps role, like you said, is something that comes like earlier in the life cycle, in the development life cycle. So can you talk a little bit about the tooling? Like, you have this build pipeline automation, you have the CI/CD tooling. So what is all that? How does that play with these DevOps principles?
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the principles that I think is common across everything is kind of like the whole idea of like don't repeat yourself, basic like software engineering practices, and not so much even from like the DevOps team's own code, but more from like an engineering standpoint. So thinking about tooling, I think obviously it starts with your source control, right? Like every team has to kind of make a decision on that. You probably, if you're hiring a DevOps team, you're probably far enough along where you've kind of tied yourself to some version control system or another. But I think that's where it really starts, right? It's like, what is our basic set of practices that we want to enforce across our version control? Like, do we want pull request approvals enabled for everything? Do we want, protected master branches, things like that? Like what, and maybe you're not going to define this up front, but you might set that as a long-term goal. Say like, if we do everything correctly, we can now get to this place where people are shipping faster, they're merging things, approvals are happening, whatever. So I can set that goal. So it starts with version control. And then once you have the version control stuff set up, then it comes down to even like dependency management systems. So are you using an internal artifactory? Are you using, GitHub packages? Are you using any of those because you don't really ship any libraries internally? Like what is your artifact store internally? So, kind of starting with that immediate step. And then you're going to think about not just dependency management systems, but then the actual build pipelines and, things like Jenkins, GitHub Actions, Circle CI. What are the requirements there? And so this is an interesting part because I think the DevOps team also almost not just thinks about tooling, but they need to be kind of product managers in some sense, where they're thinking about like, hey, what are the things we need in order to like support the rest of our organization, right? It's like, do you have the capacity to build like parallelization and caching and all this stuff yourself into your build pipelines? If not, okay, maybe you're not going to go with something as bare bones as Jenkins and you want to buy something off the shelf, right? So kind of figuring out like, what is a use case? Like what kind of tools are we building? Are we building lots of really heavy Docker containers? Are we just building small JavaScript projects? Like what is the standard thing you're doing? Because now you've got your kind of build pipeline set up in place. And then your build pipeline is obviously going to do a bunch of stuff, right? It's like you're going to run tests. You're going to ideally take that test coverage and ship it off somewhere so you can track that. So you're going to probably own like a SonarQube instance or something similar to that. You're going to also have, whatever your cloud engineering team, if they exist and if they've built something, like whatever that pipeline is to get things into that system. And so thinking about that infrastructure there, thinking about alerting and incident management. So are you, like if builds are failing, like is that something that's alertable? So are you going to be integrating with your incident management tools, like sending that information in there? Are you going to be integrating with Slack or Teams or whatever to send information to developers about those builds? And so all these kinds of things that are part of that process is definitely not necessarily owned by DevOps, but it's something that they need to have a lot of say in and say like, hey, here's how we're going to be consuming a lot of those things. And then, and this is where we're kind of inching into like more of the observability and monitoring space is obviously you're observing and monitoring your actual build system and pipelines, all the tools that you run, but also things like build flakiness and those kind of metrics where you want to be tracking and giving that visibility. And so you have your own things that you're going to be trying to get into the monitoring world. And so I think this is kind of like the general stack that I think most DevOps teams are working with. And so kind of thinking, going back to what I was talking about, like don't repeat yourself, I think as a DevOps team is looking at their entire stack, they should be thinking about, hey, how do we abstract away a lot of our stack and make it easy for developers to consume it, right? So maybe you're not opinionated on, when things send Slack messages, but you want to make it easy for teams to say like, okay, if I want to send a Slack message from my pipeline, here's how I do it. And so kind of give them the tools to do those things that A, makes it easy for developers, but B, follows your own practices. So you're not maintaining now like 15 versions of a Slack messaging system that's like sending messages over, right? It's like you want to keep your own life easier. So like I think DevOps teams as part of their stack should be thinking about design principles and things like that as well, because it's going to make their life hell in the future if they don't do that from day one.
Yeah, that really rings very close to my heart because I see that, like you say, most DevOps teams come in with the tooling as a religion and then it just gets, outdated or you don't have budgets for that and you have to move to something else. And then the reason why you're doing it is completely lost. So yeah, I think stepping back and having abstraction is a great piece of advice.
Yeah, I think that's what makes like great DevOps engineers and SREs and cloud engineers is like almost having that product hat. I know like all of these roles are highly technical. And so that's why I've seen really high functioning DevOps teams and SRE teams. Sometimes they even have a product manager like embedded into the team that is like extremely technical because you are kind of, your customer is the internal development team, right? Like that is who your customer is. Like we can talk about SRE's customers, which differ slightly, but like for the DevOps team, their customer is development. And so if you have a customer, then you should be thinking about how do I enable them to do their job? Like that is your charter at the end of the day, right? And so really taking a step back and saying, how do I enable those teams to do their best? And I think having that lens, having that product hat on, I think helps DevOps engineers kind of perform a lot better. And like, I think it gives you visibility into like, hey, here are the things I should be working. So you're not going off and building things and wasting your own time. It helps you prioritize, like, these are the most high impact things that I could be doing. And so I think that product hat is super, super important.
That's very interesting because that was one thing I had not really thought about. So yeah, that's good to know. So apart from your traditional DevOps tooling skill, having a kind of ability to step back, abstract, look at things at a little bit higher level will make you successful at your job.
Exactly.
Okay. I wanted to now switch gears to SRE. And I think from the site reliability engineering book from Google, I remember this analogy, which of course, as a mother, it just completely made a lot of sense. I just want to talk about that. It says that the analogy is between software engineering and labor and children. So it says the labor before the birth is painful and difficult, but the labor after the birth is where you actually spend most of your effort. And so I just wanted to talking a little bit about that a quote, which is so true in real life, but also in software engineering. How do you think that kind of comes into this SRE role? Do you agree with that?
Yeah, I definitely think so. That's a really funny way of putting it, but I think it's totally true. And I think when I think about the work that goes in before production, before things are out, like that to me, and this is kind of a broader note on SRE generally. Like, I think that the thing that's really hard about SRE is it's very much like an influence role, right? Like, you're not just building things, but you need to get people to care about it. You need to get people to do things. Like, it's an extremely difficult role for that particular reason. Like, not even necessarily the technical side of things, which is challenging enough. And especially because SRE teams and most organizations are operating at like, a 1 to 30 to 1 to 50 ratio for like SRE to regular product engineering. And so they're trying to influence all these people to do things. And that, I think that's where a lot of the hard work really comes in. And so kind of thinking about the first part, like, what is that initial upfront labor? It's like, okay, figuring out based on our charter again, what are the things that we don't have that we need in order to get to a world where we can accomplish our charter, right? Like, it's not even like, how do we accomplish our charter, but how do we get to a place where we could reasonably figure out how to accomplish our charter? And so that's where you're setting up your monitoring and observability stack. You're doing things like setting standards for tracing, for logging, for metrics. Like, everything kind of has to be standardized. You want people to be doing things in similar ways. That way you can kind of, things are flowing into the right systems. You have reporting built on top of that. And once you have all this stuff kind of defined, then it's like, you're running after people and saying like, hey, like, you're still running, our old tracing system. Like, can you please add the span ID to your traces? Can you do X, Y, and Z? Like, you're trying to push other people to do this. And I think that's where a lot of that pain comes from for SREs, is like, SREs given this charter to be like, hey, can you make our company more reliable, right? And that's fallen on the SRE team, but it's not really a charter for the rest of the organization, right? And like, so SRE is trying to take their charter and make everyone else do it, because that's kind of what the role is. And so that's where a lot of that initial upfront effort works, is like getting people to care about those things and driving that visibility. Because once you have that, then it's a matter of like, okay, we've kind of had this foundation. And so now we're seeing what the problems are in order to get to that final charter. And then it's like same thing all over again. Now you're just like, it's like kind of whack-a-mole, right? It's like that, kind of like the raising a child analogy. It's like, okay, it's there, we got everything, but now there's like, it needs so much more nurturing to get to our final state. And so it's like, okay, we're going to start small. We're going to be like, everyone needs to set up your monitors. Okay, now we have monitors. Okay, now you're going to set up alerting. You're going to set up on-call. Okay, you're going to connect your monitors to your rotation. You're going to make sure you have contacts. You have, so on and so forth. It's like, you need that foundation and like really push the organization to get there. And then you can start nurturing the organization to get to that final state. So that's kind of how I think about like those two sides of the equation.
Yeah, I think like when you talked about logging and the tracing, I think that is like an art, I would say. It's almost like, maybe it's a science. Sorry, I should say that. I think could be a book in itself, or maybe a
100%
podcast in itself. But yeah, that's very true. But switching into that, I think if I specifically come into the metrics angle. So what would be the metrics that say the DevOps teams look at versus SRE? If you could just again break it down for us.
Yeah, absolutely. So when I think about DevOps teams, like, you're thinking about developer productivity, things like that. And so your metrics are going to be more around like the actual operational side of things, like the developer operation side of things. So things like build flakiness. So like, are there issues with the build system? Are there like specific repositories or services that are causing a lot of build failures? How do we prevent that? How do we detect that kind of stuff? Because that is where a lot of time goes away. So actually taking a step back, when you think about DevOps, is like, how much time are like developers spending like actually writing code versus how much time are they spending dealing with tooling, right? And the more you can reduce the dealing with tooling side of things, the better. And so things like that, things like time to production is another great one. And so this is where like, the collaboration between DevOps and cloud engineering really comes into play is like, yeah, it's a time to production. Like, is it easy for DevOps teams to get things into the cloud platform? But is it easy for developers to kind of traverse their systems into that? So, time to code, time to production, or time to whatever X environment, things like basic like build times, are there bottlenecks on the build systems? So I think those are the kinds of metrics that DevOps teams are obviously looking at. I mean, they have like monitoring type metrics as well. Like if your Jenkins goes down, then obviously you have a problem. So you're looking at similar metrics and logs and things like that from your systems. But the things that you own are more of these kind of like operational metrics that tell you like, hey, are we accomplishing our charter in that same way? And so I think it's interesting in that SRE, I mean, DevOps kind of owns certain sets of metrics that necessarily like SRE on the other side doesn't own a metric in the same way, right? They can't impact their own metrics. Like if SRE is looking at uptime as like their final goal, or like, their SLOs and what they're breaching, at the end of the day, like they can only tell developers like, hey, your service is breaching that threshold and we're going to page you or whatever. But like an SRE team can't do anything about it, versus DevOps kind of owns their own metrics. Like they have these kind of things that they are going to push forward. And I think that's some of like the slight differences there between like the DevOps and the SRE side.
Okay, interesting. So the metrics can actually help DevOps teams get better, whereas SRE, even if they look at the metrics, they're dependent on somebody else to fix it.
Exactly. I think that's where like that pain comes in for the SRE side, where it's like, again, it's like an influence job. Like you can only tell people like, hey, something is wrong with your service and here's what we're seeing, but you can't do anything about it. Versus DevOps, again, that product lens, right? It's like you have not just like technical metrics, but you have like business metrics or like these kind of like KPIs, right? It's like, that's the interesting thing. And you might have a whole bunch of SLIs underneath that, but you're tracking against like business metrics. You're not just looking at like uptime or whatever, like more like technical things.
So I think I'll ask you to also explain SLO and SLI again for us, just to make sure everybody's on the same page.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think when you think about SLOs are your actual objective, right? It's like, hey, we are trying to get to like, 99% uptime or whatever, like things like that. So that is your final objective. The SLI is like an indicator that tells you, am I meeting my objective? That's the simplest way I like to describe it, is like the SLO is literally, what are we trying to accomplish? And the SLI is like the indicator that tells us if we are doing that. So your uptime metric could be your SLI, and your SLO is the target. So you have I have a 99% uptime SLO. The SLI is like the uptime indicator. Like, what is our current uptime? Like, what is it looking like over time? So that's kind of how I think about SLO and SLI. And then you have SLAs, which are more of like the actual agreements or promises. So you might have like a 6 nines, or like let's say you have a 3 nines SLA. So you've committed to a customer that you have a 3 nines SLA from uptime. Your SLO might be 4 nines because that's your objective. Because if you meet that, then internally you're tracking correctly against your agreement, your legally binding agreement with the customer. And your SLI is going to be the actual like indicator that says, how are we doing against our uptime? What is our current uptime? So that's kind of like telling us where we're going.
So in this thing where we have the service level agreements for SREs, with the customer, which is your end user, do we have something similar for DevOps? Like the end user is the developers. Can the developers say, this is the agreement I want? Or no? Or is that more a collaborative effort?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think the best engineering organizations view that those internal relationships as extremely collaborative. And I think there needs to be collaboration between all of those teams. And this is kind of like, a whole topic of its own, because I think what engineering organizations should not do is like create silos between SRE and DevOps and development. Like those teams should all work hand in hand, right? It's like, okay, your DevOps team is kind of putting their product hat, and they're thinking with talking to developers and saying, hey, what are the areas of friction? How do we make it easier for you to build things and just focus on that value, right? But your SRE team is thinking about, like how do we get people to do their monitors and their dashboarding and all this stuff? But you think about those two, like why is like SRE kind of pigeonholed into post-production? Like in theory, those things could be automated for you as well, right? Like if you are following a standard framework and you generate new projects out of that framework, and then you have a standard logging system and you have a standard metric system, in theory, your initial framework and your initial build could generate all the same things that need to get into like your SRE team cares about. So your SRE team and your DevOps team should then work together and say, hey, I'm the SRE team. These are the things that we need our developers to be doing, before they go into production. How much of that can we automate for developers as part of their pre-prod systems, right? Are there things that the build pipeline could be doing as like tagging your images with certain SHAs or whatever, so that flows into our monitoring. Or there are like things we can build into their software templates that's going to do logging the right way. And so SRE and DevOps should be working together to say, hey, DevOps, like, can you guys help us do our jobs better from day one so we're not like scrambling afterwards, right? And the same thing between like the cloud platform and the DevOps teams, like DevOps team saying, hey, here's what our current status quo is. Like, this is what we need from you in order to like do our jobs better. So like, how do we figure out, how do we structuring our platform so that's going to be a lot easier, things like that. And so I think all of those teams especially should be collaborating between each other, and that's going to make the developer's life a lot easier. So imagine like the dream world where, a developer comes in, they don't necessarily know what all the underlying infrastructure is, right? It's like maybe on Kubernetes, it doesn't really matter. I come in, I have a set of software templates, and say, okay, I want to create a Spring Boot service. And I go into whatever our internal portal is, I select a Spring Boot template, boom, it creates a repository for me with the same settings that DevOps recommends. It generates the code. That code is already pre-configured with the right logging structure. It's configured with the right monitors. It's going to get set up. It's configured with the right build pipeline that integrates with what DevOps already set up. It's integrated with SonarQube, and the metrics are already going there. Boom, I write my code. I merge it to master. Deploy pipeline picks it up. It goes into our infrastructure. Metrics are starting to flow into whatever monitoring tool you're using. You've got your metrics set in place. As a developer, all I did was I just followed this template and I did a couple of things and everything just magically works. Like, that's the dream land that we can get to. And the only way you can get there is if all of those teams are collaborating with each other really, really closely. And all of them are kind of wearing their product's hats and thinking like, this is not just a technical problem. It's about how do we as an engineering organization deliver faster for our end customer users. And so I think that's kind of what engineering organizations should be striving to.
So actually, in a way, all of us should be working on that SLA with the end user.
Exactly. Yeah, everyone should own that just to some extent. Yeah.
That's great. I wanted to ask you also, in terms of roles, when we go back to it, there used to be this role called a system admin. Is that now dead? We don't see that at all, right?
Yeah, I think that's kind of gone by the wayside. I think you still see it at some organizations where if you have legacy infrastructure that you need to operate in some ways, then like that kind of falls under the cloud platform-ish teams. And so I think that's kind of merged into like, depending on where you lived as a system admin, you might go more into like the cloud platform engineering team, or you might be more on the DevOps side. I think there's not really any overlap with the SRE side of things, but if your like sysadmining skills were around like, pipelines and build systems and being able to things like that stuff, you might go more into the DevOps side of things. Like if you're like a heavy Unix person and you've got all your commands and you can kind of figure out networking and those kinds of things, you're going to be a great fit for cloud platform engineering. And like, that's probably like the future there. So I think it's like sysadmin was kind of a very broad role. It's like, hey, we've got these like mega machines and we have no idea what the hell those systems are doing. And we need somebody that's like a Unix guru to figure it out. But now it's like, okay, we've got specialized teams that have those charters. So you can kind of figure out like what exactly you want to be doing and really focusing in on that.
And would it be that from that similar context, would it be easier if a developer wants to go to a DevOps or an SRE role, would he be a better fit for SRE or say DevOps?
I think it's interesting again, because what we usually see is a lot of developers really care or specialize in one of those. There's people that really care about infrastructure. They love, like they come into like a young organization, things are starting to get a bit hairy, and there's like, hey, I'm going to take a week. I'm going to set up Terraform. I'm going to set up infrastructure as code. I'm going to set up our VPCs, whatever. It's like, that's going to make my life easier. It's going to make me a lot happier. So I'm going to go and do that infrastructure stuff. Okay, you're probably going more towards cloud platform engineering at that point, right? So that's kind of like one set of engineers. And then you have another set of engineers that are like, oh my God, the build's taking forever. Like we got to go in and fix those systems. Like everyone's doing things differently. I hate our like lack of standardization. I want to bring some sort of like standards and order to the chaos, probably more like this like DevOps-y type space. And then there's some people that really care about monitoring and uptime and standards and tracing and like logging and like that kind of stuff. It's like they kind of freak out. Like, I have no idea what's going on in production. Like I have no visibility. Like I feel like I can't sleep at night because I don't know what's going to happen. Okay, you're probably more like leaning into that SRE space. So I think what we see is like developers usually have like one passion area that they really really like, or they spend a lot of time in. And so I think that kind of naturally they have a path to those worlds.
What about, this ability there are certain engineers who come in as DevOps engineers. So they have this ability to write custom scripts, things to do all the automation. So is that a big skill to have in both these spaces, or only say DevOps?
Yeah, I would say I think very solid like software engineering skills when it comes to like coding probably is more required on like cloud platform engineering and DevOps. Because yeah, like you're going to be hacking things together. You got a bunch of systems that got to talk to each other. Like you're more active in that space. So I think generally speaking, like you need to be good at coding, not necessarily like system design or architecture or things like that high level abstraction. And I think that's where we're like, when like a DevOps or a cloud platform engineer is coming into like a software engineering role, that's kind of where like they're really good at writing code, but maybe need to take a step back and like think about like software design principles in some cases. SRE is kind of the inverse, where like you don't necessarily have to be like an amazing coder, but you need to be able to think about like the systems and how they interact and more of like that architecture side of things. And so I think that's where their skill set is. And so maybe not so much the minutia of like, hey, how do I get GitHub Action to talk to our legacy Jenkins build, which is part of our migration and blah, blah, like that stuff is like probably like too in the weeds for like an SRE team, but they're thinking more about like, hey, how do our systems interact? Where are the bottlenecks, the critical areas of risk? And so there's definitely like some overlap in skill set, but that's kind of where I see SRE teams have most of their thinking hats on.
Okay, so more of the details on the system interactions and things like that and how your systems talk to each other would be DevOps, and taking a step back and looking at flows to see where bottlenecks are would be SRE.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay, I now want to switch gears a bit into, say, the communication angle. So one of the things that is interesting from SRE is, and I guess it's also in DevOps, is when the incident occurs, they do this thing called as blame-free postmortems. Can you explain that? I believe from at the book on the SRE, the site reliability engineering from Google, they talk a lot more about this. But is it a similar concept also for DevOps?
Yeah, I definitely think so. Like, I think if there's an issue with how somebody has set up their pipelines or they're not integrating with your tooling the right way or whatever, I think your first question should be, what was the gap, right? Like, was there a gap in our tooling that said like, hey, I need to go off and build my own thing because like the current systems that we provided don't work, right? Like, what is the reason why the developer like went off the rails somewhere, went off like outside of those guardrails to go and do something that the DevOps team hasn't kind of given their stamp to? That should be our first question. Again, going back to like the product hat, right? It's like, don't blame the user. Like there might be something wrong, right? It's like, is there something that we should be working on? That's kind of step one. Step two is like, okay, maybe there was no thing. Then why did they kind of go down that path, right? Like, was it a lack of evangelism? Like, what, did they not know that these systems existed? Did they not like fully understand it? Okay, if that's the case, then maybe there needs to be more like education within the organization, right? Taking opportunities for lunch and learn, thinking opportunities for internal guides or wikis that talk about this stuff. Maybe there should be automated tooling. And, the kind of thinking about like, what are the process things that went wrong to get here? And so again, it's not about blaming the folks that did something quote unquote wrong, but understanding how do we make sure that doesn't happen again? Because like, sure, you can blame someone all you want, but you're going to hire somebody else is going to do the same thing again. And you're just going to keep blaming everybody. You're going to figure out like, hey, how do we as a team just accept that this is going to happen and make sure that we have processes in place to ensure that it doesn't? How do we make sure that we are able to accomplish our charter outside of what those teams are doing, right? Like, that's kind of what it comes down to for like blame-free postmortems as well. It's like things are going to happen. Incidents will always happen. No matter how brilliant of a programmer you are, an SRE team you are, something is going to go wrong. And so when something goes wrong, you want to take a step back and say like, okay, something went wrong. Doesn't matter who did it. How do we make sure this doesn't happen again? Like, that's always a question, is like, how do we prevent something like this? What were the gaps, right? It's like, we know it's going to happen and we need to make sure it doesn't. And so the DevOps team should be thinking about it the same way. It's like, we know it's going to happen again. How do we make sure it doesn't? And so I think taking that lens is super important. And I think there's more of a collaboration element here as well, where they need to be working with developers and say like, hey, how do we make sure like that doesn't happen again? Like, what can we be doing in order to better enable you? And so, yeah, I think blame-free culture, I think, is just important generally. And like, I think DevOps should be taking that kind of like product lens again when they see these kinds of issues on, hey, why are people not doing the things that we hope they should be doing?
That's interesting when you talk about the collaboration angle. And so this question might be a little bit long-winded, but one of the things I notice is whenever we have an incident and when you do this root cause analysis, then there is, of course, analysis done on what really happened, which maybe the SRE team looks at, and then a ticket is created. And then that either goes to, say, a DevOps or a developer team. And then there's almost like, even though we know that there should not be a blame-free culture, but then it almost looks like this work is like given to different teams. And then there's this problem of, like you said before, operating in silos, right? So that, again, then there's this problem there. And so I almost wonder, do we need to have a kind of a facilitator role as well to have this kind of blame-free postmortem? And how does communication play with all these different roles?
Yeah, I think when it comes to like postmortem specifically, like in theory, the facilitator should be SRE, and then there's kind of a conflict of interest, but that falls under their charter, right? It's like if their goal is to improve uptime or improve reliability, like doing good postmortems falls into that world, right? It's like the better you can do your postmortems, the better you can follow those action items that are coming out of it, the better you're going to be in terms of accomplishing your own charter. So it's in your best interest to enable other teams to do the things that they need to do in order to accomplish your own charter. Again, kind of going back to the idea that SRE is like an influence organization. And so when you think about like doing a postmortem, you want to be facilitating those conversations and say like, hey, did SRE provide you the tooling to say something went wrong? Like, were you able to detect it in time? Were you alerted in time? Like, what are the foundational pieces missing? And if so, we're going to take those action items back and fix it because that's our job, right? That's kind of on our systems. And then facilitating those action items and say like, here is the clear outcomes of this postmortem, right? Like somebody has to take charge and say like, okay, out of this postmortem, there's like 5 action items. And in theory, like I think what happens in a lot of cases is you create these JIRA tickets. There's like 15 tickets that come out of a postmortem, and there's no prioritization in place. Like nobody, they're just there in the void, and people either take them or they don't. And it's like the classic thing that happens with these postmortems, right? And so I think coming out of a postmortem, the SRE team should be saying like, hey, we can't leave. This postmortem is not over until we have an idea of prioritization, right? It's like, which of these things are must-haves, which of these things are should-haves, and which of these things are nice-to-haves. And so the must-haves are going to be like, hey, we are going to bother you incessantly until we know those must-haves are complete, because those are kind of what you have agreed to say like, okay, these are things that have to be fixed now, and we've kind of all agreed on this within this postmortem. The should-haves are something you probably want to track somewhere. It's like, hey, are we building up these should-haves? Like, how do we continuously go back to the development teams and say like, hey, we need your help to prioritize these things? And so I think, yeah, the SRE team kind of plays that facilitator role a little bit. But it also comes down to like those engineering managers on the development teams as well, right? It's like, if you're an engineering manager, if you're a product manager, you can't lose track of the fact that you are working closely with the SRE team, right? You are enabling the SRE team to do their charter, right? Like if you are just like, hey, screw you guys, like we're just going to go off and do our own thing, you're not creating a good working environment internally. So as an engineering manager or product manager, it is your job to kind of go back and say like, hey, how do we, as our team, help our fellow sibling teams to do their jobs as well? So like, we're going to do our best and they're going to do their best. I think that's the kind of general engineering culture you want to create. But yeah, the SRE team, I think, is like the facilitator within the postmortem boundary itself.
Yeah, that's interesting because I read this article which said that the SRE practice involves contributions to like every level of the organization. I think that probably makes sense because they are then playing that facilitator role, right? Because they'll talk to, I guess, the product owners, the developers, the engineering managers, and then, yeah, and I guess the DevOps teams to have this communication. So would you say that, so this is another skill set for an SRE, good communication skills?
Absolutely. Yeah, I think it goes back to like, yeah, SRE is an influence role, right? It's like
Influence
in
role.
many cases, when an SRE team is formed, it was probably because you are starting to see reliability as like a key business driver, right? Like there's a reason why you're investing. Nobody's going to invest in reliability if it doesn't matter, right? And there's like some key business reason why you're investing in reliability and uptime and things like that. And so usually that team falls under the VP engineering or the CTO directly. There's like, the development team to the SRE team kind of directly reports up into the VP engineering. And so there's like a clear line of communication there. But then you also have kind of visibility into the rest of the organization, and you need to influence the rest of the organization. And so being able to communicate to leadership where the bottlenecks are and like what you need resources and help in, kind of driving across the org, as well as communicating directly to engineers and within your own team. I think that's kind of like a unique skill set that SREs need to have. Because in some cases, it's like the SRE team cannot necessarily directly influence the engineering team directly. And they almost need to, let's say, like, hey, VP, like, here's what we need from the engineering organization. We know it's a broader effort, but here's why it's important. And we need your help in order to like make this a key initiative. And so it's kind of like an up to go out type of a model. And I mean, you see this in a few other functions as well. Like security is a great example of this, where security is like, okay, guys, figure out how you're going to make our software more secure. And they're trying to get developers to do things, and like they're trying to communicate up to the CISO or whatever. And it's a kind of a similar thing where it's like a go up to go out type of a system. And so SRE is very similar in that case, where it's like you need to be able to communicate up, you need to be able to communicate out, you need to figure out how you're going to drive that influence. And so there's definitely a lot of communication involved. And it's not the first thing you think about when you think about SRE, but it's like, I think that's where a lot of people that go into SRE kind of have that initial shock is like, there's a lot more like people stuff going on in this role than you would initially expect. Like it's not just a technical role. It's one of the fun things about the role as well, but it's definitely something that people don't realize as you go into it.
Okay, that's good to know. And I guess now moving into the sort of the last bit of the section on this episode, I want to talk a little bit on the day-to-day life of an SRE versus a DevOps, as you would see it. So what would a good day for an SRE look like?
Good day for an SRE, you're probably writing a doc somewhere on like your future state on, what reliability looks like. There's no incidents, monitoring and metrics are flowing beautifully. There's no postmortems. All the action items are empty. There's nothing in Jira. That's a beautiful day for an SRE. Now, does that ever happen? Probably not. But like a more realistic day, I think, is a combination of kind of like, goal setting, like kind of thinking about doing analysis on the metrics that you're accountable for like uptime and saying like, hey, where are the issues? Are there things that are popping up that we don't really know about? Who should we be talking to about these things? I think it's probably part of your day. Another part of your day is probably talking to other engineering teams and talking to them about SLOs and adoption and things like that. That's going to be part of your day. Another part is like evangelizing things. So you're probably defining like SRE readiness standards and things like that and, communicating that to the rest of the organization. One thing we didn't talk about at all is like the kind of initial SRE concept of like being the initial on-call team as well. So like, I think there was like a period of time in which SRE was also the first line of defense. Like they would be on call for things and then they would escalate it to engineering teams. What's interesting is we don't really see that as often these days. I know Google still kind of does things that way, but it's more of like a you build it, you own it type of model in most organizations now. And so I would say like in some organizations and SREs day-to-day might be like, like fielding the pager or whatever, like being on call for things that are like not their own things, but like things that other people have built. But we don't really see that happening as often these days, especially at companies that are like sub 1,000 engineers. But it's mostly like, the teams are going to be on call for the things that they own. And maybe there's a separate like support team that's on call generally that's going to be escalating things through the pipe. But I think that's kind of generally the day-to-day is like a bit of, your standard like observability, monitoring, incident management, being part of these ongoing issues, being that sounding board, the postmortem facilitator, the incident facilitator, evangelism, and the kind of like goal setting and working with the DevOps and cloud engineering team and things like that. So those are kind of like the things that we usually see in like a general day-to-day.
Okay. And I guess, like you said, so a bad day would be would I only have a bad day if I was a first line of defense? Or, I mean, I guess you could have a bad day even in other things, but would it be more stressful if I was, so almost like the first line of defense?
Yeah, I think that's when it would get really bad, but I think you can still have a very bad day if there's incidents generally across your organization, because like we talked about, like the SRE team is kind of the facilitator. So they are still operating as part of those incidents. They're being that sounding board, they're facilitating it, they're looping in the right people, they're making sure that their systems are looking good. They're making sure that the right data is being provided to the team so they can make clear decisions. They're providing insight into like the escalation path, escalation policies. So they're kind of like, not in all cases, but in many cases, they're kind of like running that incident commander type role as well. So they're kind of in charge because that incident is like directly affecting their final metric, which is like uptime or reliability or whatever. And so it's in their best interest to run that incident as smoothly as possible. And so regardless of whether like the first line engineer, whether they are triaging and resolving incidents from the get-go, or whether you're like, it's a you build it, you own it type of a model, you're still involved in those incidents and you're still trying to figure out and help those teams. And so on top of everything else you're trying to do, I think that can be a bad day. Another example of a bad day is like, you're trying to get people to do things, but you don't have any say into it. And like other teams are saying, hey, we've got these deadlines, we've got these other things we're working on. Like our manager says, we don't have time for this. And you're just blocked. Like you just can't do anything because you're blocked on everyone else. And I think that's almost the most frustrating thing, where it's like, I am not able to do my job because I'm not getting that buy-in from other organizations, and no fault of their own either, right? It's like they have their own things that they have to be working on, like their managers and directors, whatever, telling them this is your priority, like ignore reliability, it doesn't matter. But reliability is like, no, reliability matters, like that's what matters to us. And so like, how do you kind of cross those boundaries? And so I think a really bad day is when that collaboration breaks down, right? Like, and it happens in every organization, and you need to be working on that. I think that can be a very like emotionally draining bad day, because like you just can't do what you're trying to accomplish. So I think those are some examples of what bad days can be.
Okay, great. I think, that kind of really drove home the point where, you could get terribly frustrated if you can't really do your job because it depends on someone else. Yeah.
Exactly.
I think obviously I have to ask you now what a bad day for a DevOps engineer looks like. Is it just that, say, if GitHub is not working or is down, or say Azure DevOps is down or Jenkins is down, is that a bad day?
Yeah, I would say like when the actual things that you own are down, like that's kind of a bad day for everyone. And it's like you build it, you own it type thing again. Like you own those systems, the systems are down, and your developers are like, what the hell? Like I can't do anything. That's probably a really bad day for developers, for the DevOps teams. But another like lesser thought about bad days, like when you hear frustrations from developers, like kind of just generally, it's like this is not working for me. Like this sucks. Like I'm not able to build. Like it's super flaky, whatever. It's like the things that you're building are not working for teams. And I think that can be really frustrating, again, from an emotional way. It's like, hey, whatever we're trying to do is not working. And like, we're not able to enable those teams. And I think, again, like this is where for both the SRE and like DevOps teams, like that product hat, like if you're a product manager for a consumer app and you hear consumers saying like, this product sucks, like I don't want to use it, like I'm going to churn, whatever, like that's what sucks as a product manager, because the decisions that we made clearly are not working, or like we're not able to execute on our goals. And, I guess in the consumer app, people might churn. In this case, like obviously people are not going to churn, but like they're going to complain, or like you're going to feel that frustration kind of bubbling up, and you may not be able to do anything about that. So I think that can be a bad day, is like you're working on things and it's not working correctly for teams. You're not enabling teams the right way. There's some gap in like, what you thought was going to be the right path forward. I think those days could be like very emotionally taxing and emotionally like a bad day for DevOps teams.
And to come back on a positive note, and a good day would be when nobody's complaining.
Yeah, when like things are just happening and you see a lot of activity on like people are building things, people are deploying things, everything's just magically happening, new projects are being created, and nobody has any questions for you, nobody has any feature requests for you. That means you've almost like taken yourself out of the equation. It's like you have built a system in which people can operate without the guidance of DevOps, and everything is just working seamlessly. I think that's a wonderful day. It's like, hey, the stuff we're building is working, and teams are enabled, and teams are off just building things and doing things for the business, as opposed to like grappling with infrastructural things. So I think that can be a really, really satisfying day for DevOps teams.
That's great. And now that you've laid all of this out for us, who do you think gets paid more? Is it an SRE or a DevOps?
I think nowadays it's starting to kind of get a bit more equal. I think what we see is like DevOps teams can be a bit more junior in some cases. So I think that's where some of the pay disparity comes, is like you can probably get somebody kind of fresh out of college, a new grad who has some coding experience. You can train them to be good DevOps engineers. And so you can kind of get away with the fewer like junior folks, whereas SRE teams are a bit more experienced. They need to understand where bottlenecks can be and best practices and all that stuff. And so I think that's why on average you see SRE teams might be being paid more, but I think it's because DevOps teams in a lot of cases just have slightly more junior folks across the board. But I think, once you're kind of mid-career on both, you're probably at the same pay grade.
Okay. So that's interesting, because I wanted to ask you about, the career progression for SRE versus DevOps. Would I be right in saying that after a point, maybe would there be a stagnation for a DevOps, or is that not the case?
Yeah, I think it depends on the organization. Like if DevOps is kind of just working within these pipelines or whatever, it's like there's not much more you can do. Like maybe you can get into management and stuff. And so I think it really depends on the organization, because in some cases it's like there's paths to, it could like DevOps could live in the broader like developer experience, developer productivity orgs. And so it's like one piece of that. And so kind of going up into like running or being a part of like the broader developer experience team, or being kind of in charge of that, I think is like your career progression. And we're seeing a lot more developer experience and developer productivity teams coming up in more organizations. So I think there's starting to be like an even more clear path for DevOps folks. So I think that's one career path. But at other organizations, sometimes it might be like moving more into like platform or cloud engineering, going up the ranks there, or like I think like maybe SREs. I think that's where kind of like people have a bad taste in their mouth for DevOps. I think that's why people are trying to like rebrand it or rename it into all these other orgs, because in some cases, yeah, DevOps has been stagnant because your organizations haven't really thought about that charter. Like, why do we have a DevOps team? It's for developer experience and productivity and efficiency. So like, why not give DevOps the opportunity to own that entire thing? And so that's why it's like, yeah, we're kind of calling it like developer experience and things like that now. And so, yeah, I think if you are your organization where there's just DevOps and they don't own anything else, then yeah, it's probably going to kind of stagnate. But yeah, if you have the right opportunity and the DevOps team is within the right organization, there's a really great path there.
That's very interesting. So everything kind of ties back to the charter. So even I think so if your charter is clear, and so as you get more mature, then maybe the career progression is also better for the DevOps teams. And
Exactly.
that's great. ties in very well with how we started.
Absolutely.
So I guess the next question would be, do you see many other roles that emerge from these roles in the future?
Yeah, I definitely think so. Like, I think from an SRE standpoint, you probably see people starting to specialize in individual parts of SRE. So things like we're already starting to see that, and like people who are really good at monitoring and observability, people who are really good at kind of like standards and governance and compliance and things like that. People that are really good at like incident management. So maybe you might have like people that kind of specialize in that. And so as we learn more about these roles, I think we are going to see more specialization around there. And so I think that's something that for sure we'll see. And then I think in terms of like the DevOps side of things, you're probably going to see specialization in specific parts of developer experience, right? So it's going to be things like, are you working on like internal developer portals? Are you working on, observability and metrics for a developer experience side of things? Are you working on pipelines? Like, are you going to be a product manager within DevOps, right? Like, we talked about that, like it is a product hat. So is that going to be a thing as well? So I think all of those things are examples of where like we might see like a lot more specialization and individual roles kind of being carved out of these broader spaces.
Okay. So I think you talked about something called developer productivity. There are organizations which have a team that does that, is it? Okay.
Yeah, like DevProd, DevX, I think is what we see a lot of. Because like I think they finally realized like, hey, this is the charter, right? Our charter is to make developers more productive and like enable them to focus on building the stuff that actually matters. And so I think that's what we're starting to see now is like, okay, if we acknowledge that it's a charter, let's call the team that. It's developer productivity, and all these things kind of fall under developer productivity. It's like the foundation for just general product development work. So we're starting to see more organizations build out the team. And again, yeah, it just goes back to the charter being a lot more clear.
And also in terms of, you also talked about things like observability and roles coming from there. That's also very interesting. Do you see actually things like that exist today? Like, do you have like an observability team? I'm just curious about that because
yeah, we see that all the time at large organizations. So not necessarily at Cortex, but like we see like a lot of our customers, they have folks that are like specialized in observability and monitoring, because in a large organization, you might have many tools that are all kind of flowing and generating data, and you have different types of metrics, and you want to report on things, and you want those like that stuff to flow into a single place. You want to set standards on how you're doing monitoring and alerting. There's so many things that fall under that umbrella. It's like, hey, we're just going to have a team of people that are full-time thinking about this and doing this versus like trying to have them do like 20 different things. Because if your focus is more around like, yeah, kind of like the SLOs and the adoption and the best practices and things like that, you're not going to have time to think about the minutia, the nitty gritty of like monitoring stack as a whole. And so it's like, we're going to give that team a charter. It's like anything monitoring related, that's you guys that go figure that stuff out.
So it's all boiling down to the charter, Ganesh. So
it all comes down to that. Yeah.
So I have to ask you, is that a role in itself for the future, writing charters?
I think a good executive leadership team, I think that's what they should be doing. Like, you think about a good VP engineering or a good CTO is like coming in and setting that charter. I think truly everything comes down to that. It's like when you hire an SRE team, you need to tell them, here is exactly what's wrong today, and here's the future we want to get to, and give them the autonomy to go and get to that final world, right? And I think that's my problem with kind of like this whole idea of OKRs is like key results, right? It's like you're going to give them like, oh, we want these metrics to go up by X%. Okay, cool. Maybe that works with a larger organization, but if you're building your SRE team from the ground up, it's more going to be like, here's our final end state, and you as a team figure out how you're going to get us there, and hold yourself accountable to that. That doesn't mean like not having key results doesn't mean there's no accountability, but like you need to help them define that vision for how they're going to get there. And so I think that's why that charter is so important. Even things for like SLOs, right? It's like, a lot of organizations will come in that's like, oh, Google does these SLOs, we're going to do the same thing. But if you're a smaller team, like maybe your SLOs are not necessarily like uptime driven, right? Your SLOs might be, hey, we have a payment system and our payment fraud rate is X, Y, and Z. And so we want to drive that particular rate down. And that is our business service objective, right? Like that's kind of some of the things we want to think about. So SRE team should be given that, again, like if the organization has a charter, SRE team can say like, okay, how do we get and enable teams to get to that state? And so I think, that's what you see in really high performing organizations. Every team knows why their team is important and what their goal is, and they can just work towards that with autonomy. I think that's why it's super important to have those charters. And I think that role really falls at the very top. Like leadership needs to be setting those goals at a very high level, and then it needs to trickle down as well. So yeah, I think that's where the charters really start.
So I guess if I were to summarize this whole thing, apart from say the DevOps versus SRE debate that we started off with, like some of the key areas that I'm seeing is that we need to like that final SLA, like everybody should be looking at that. So that's one angle, having a good charter. And I think this whole communication piece comes from strong leadership. I think that's one big thing. But how do you also trickle that down to these individual teams who are operating? How do you find that purpose? Is that something would the recommendation then be that you go for like customer workshops or something like that? Like you see what the end user does with even people who are like really down in the hierarchy, for them to get a feel of that what their work is important. How do you kind of, in your experience, how do you get that vision driven down to them?
Yeah, I think a lot of it comes down to like cross-team communication upwards as well. And so like as an SRE team, if there's something that you really want to drive, right, you want to take a step back and say, hey, how does it affect the bottom line? Like maybe there's like a quantification element to it. Like we're seeing, X hours being spent on incident resolution. And if we had more visibility or automation around automatic incident resolution, we would save X hours. And so this is why investing in this infrastructure and this monitoring and tooling is going to be super important. It drives X% engineering cost. And so, okay, now your leadership understands why that's super important and how that gets you to your charter. And then they can then communicate that to the rest of the org. And you can say like, hey, we're not just doing things for the sake of doing things. Here is like the impact, right? You want to always define that if we do X, here is going to be the future state, right? It's like, you can't just go to other teams and be like, we need you to do X. They're not going to understand that, right? It all comes down to that collaboration. And this is just basic communication practices as well, right? Like if you're an engineer working in a product team, you don't want your product manager to say like, here's a ticket, like go implement it, right? It's like, here's what we're trying to do. Here's how this like helps us get to that final state. And then as a developer, you feel like, hey, I'm part of a bigger thing. I have this impact. I understand why I'm doing the things I'm doing or why this is super important for the broader organization. And I think DevOps and SRE is no different. You can just say like, here's what we're doing. Like, here's like, we need everyone to migrate onto Circle CI. Like, oh my God, like I've got like 15 other tickets I'm working on. Like, you can't just tell me that. It's like, hey, it's because we're seeing a lot of whatever build failures. And we think that these particular features are going to help us get there. And therefore that's going to help you by reducing, your cycle time on PRs. Like you want to have that communication. And even when we talk about like Cortex and developer portals, which is what we do, we tell people saying like, hey, if I had a developer portal, I could do X. Like set that vision and say like, here's why we're doing this. And then you can get people bought in and say like, oh my God, that future end state sounds awesome. Like, how can we help you get there? Right. So like the more you can set that like final end goal and a very concrete end goal, the easier it's going to be for people to feel like, hey, I know why I'm doing the stuff I'm doing. Like it is high impact. It's meaningful. So you can't just give people things to do, but you got to tell them, here's why we're doing it. And here's the impact that you're going to have.
So I think if I were to end it, so apart from the charter, there's also data, which you said, that concrete way of looking at it, right? So
exactly.
Charter, have concrete data to like, bind to the charter, and then you can have all the magic and have a good communication and build a successful platform.
Exactly. Yeah.
It's great. It's been very enlightening for me, Ganesh, personally, and I hope it is for the listeners of the show as well. And before I let you go, I wanted to find out, where can people reach you if they wanted to contact you? Would it be on Twitter or LinkedIn?
Yeah, if you're interested in hearing more about this stuff, obviously this is what I do for a living, is working with all of these teams and helping them accomplish their charters. So you can just shoot me an email, ganesh@cortex.io, and hopefully I will find it in my inbox.
Okay, we'll do that. I'll also add a link to your Twitter and LinkedIn on the show notes, apart from the other references. So thank you for coming on the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
Great. This is Priyanka Raghavan for Software Engineering Radio. Thanks for listening.
Thanks for listening to SE Radio, an educational program brought to you by IEEE Software Magazine. For more about the podcast, including other episodes, visit our website at se-radio.net. To provide feedback, you can comment on each episode on the website or reach us on LinkedIn, Facebook, Twitter, or through our Slack channel at seradio.slack.com. You can also email us at team@se-radio.net. This and all other episodes of SE Radio is licensed under Creative Commons License 2.5. Thanks for listening.